My guest today, Michael Wee, has taught bioethics at the largest Catholic seminary in Britain, is a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life, and is a researcher at the Anscombe Bioethics Centre in Oxford, England, an institute that is our topic of discussion today. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much, Father.
So, Michael, tell us a little bit about the Anscombe Bioethics Centre.
So the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, in essence, is the National Catholic Bioethics Institute for the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. We were founded in 1977 by the Catholic bishops of England and Wales, and I should say a long time before many nation-states themselves established their own presidential or national commissions or committees for bioethics. I think that shows something of the foresight of our Catholic bishops at the time, that they wanted an institute dedicated to the study of ethical questions raised by medicine. And so here we are today, more than 40 years later, serving the Catholic Church in the whole of the United Kingdom and in Ireland. Our work falls under three broad headings, I would say. Research and scholarship, that's our primary purpose as a research institute. Public education, we go out to schools, to universities, to parish groups. We even appear on the media, such as EWTN programs, to talk about bioethics to the Catholic community and the general public at large, and particularly to medical students and healthcare professionals. And we also respond to government consultations. We engage with public agencies, public bodies involved in healthcare policy.
Now, you are a researcher. What does that work involve?
So I guess research is a bit of a broad word these days. And some people, when you say I'm a researcher in bioethics, they hear researcher and bio and they think that I'm in a lab and that I'm looking at test tubes or looking down a microscope every day. Well, I don't have a test tube, I don't have a microscope, I don't even have a lab for the work that I do. When it comes to bioethics, it's a study of moral philosophy, moral theology, primarily, I would say, from a Catholic point of view. But bioethics is such a large field. It's an interdisciplinary field that also encompasses other areas of study, such as sociology, law, obviously biomedicine itself. The key thing for me as an ethicist is to remember that the questions we pose and the way we answer them is distinct from the kinds of questions posed by, for example, scientists or doctors.
Yes.
Scientists or doctors might be looking for the best way to solve a certain problem, the best technology, the best way of refining a particular medical procedure. That's not our question, not directly at least. We're asking whether in the first place is a particular procedure compatible with human dignity?
Yes.
Is a particular way of doing things always respectful of all parties involved, and indeed not just of the individual or their family, but also of the way society structures its laws? For example, does it protect dignity? Does it protect conscience? Does it allow for unwanted effects in the way that health policy is
and these are certainly relevant questions for us today. We have so many new technologies, abilities to do things we never could have dreamed of in the past. And so these new technologies mean that we have to look at, is this something morally good? Is it something that we should pursue? For example, experimentation on embryos or those sorts of things.
Yes. Yes, I think quite often, well, when you work as in a Catholic institute, especially in bioethics, in a country like Britain, which though historically Christian, today is very much a secular place, you do find that you don't always have a natural audience before you when you're communicating what you're trying to defend, what you're trying to advance in terms of your moral position. Very often people see the Catholic Church as simply condemning everything.
Right.
Bioethics, it's just about saying no, about condemning this, saying that you can't use this, that you can't use that. And I think that one of the challenges for us is not just to stay true to Catholic doctrine. I mean, that for me, that goes without saying. That's not
Yes.
even negotiable. But it's about what some people have called affirmative orthodoxy, that you promote the orthodox standpoint in terms of doctrine and morals, but in a way that emphasizes the yes to life, the yes to dignity, the yes to conscience, rather than the no. It doesn't mean we soft pedal the no. It doesn't mean we don't talk about that. We would be irresponsible if we pretended that certain procedures, say euthanasia, were actually okay, or they could be done on the sly. That would be irresponsible of us. But we have to, in a way, flip the question around. So often the debates we see in the media today are framed by people who are not friendly to our point of view, and they may have the best of intentions.
Right.
They may genuinely want to reduce the suffering of patients who are coming to the end of their lives. I don't doubt the genuineness of their concern there, but the way they're framing the question, for example, assuming as a basis for their arguments that personal autonomy is or ought to be unfettered, that's not a standpoint that we can begin with, at least not in the way it's often articulated. So we have to flip the question, we have to flip the framing around. And
so
say,
the
well,
church,
yeah.
So the church is not anti-science, and I know that you come from a philosophical background. That was kind of what you were attracted to show the philosophical underpinnings of the church's teaching.
Yes. So again, as I mentioned, bioethics, and certainly Catholic bioethics, is a very interdisciplinary field. Many of my colleagues in the field come from theology. Personally, I don't. I studied philosophy at university. I'm writing a doctorate in moral philosophy at the moment. So I don't consider myself a theologian in the academic sense, which is not to say that my own academic work in bioethics doesn't crisscross into theology. But I think when you approach Catholic bioethics as a philosopher rather than as a theologian, you do quite quickly realize that the way you talk about, for example, human life, the way you talk about sexuality and reproduction, there is very little in common that you can assume with your interlocutor, who will not often accept, for example, a quote from scripture or a quote from the catechism as a definitive go-to point for settling a disagreement. When you study philosophy, you might say the annoying thing about studying philosophy is that everything is questioned. There's always a why to everything. It's a bit like talking to young children, who I think are natural philosophers in that respect. I have a son, a very young child at home, so I know that from personal experience. It's always about why this and why that in philosophy. And obviously, when you're a Catholic doing philosophy, you know that these questions do terminate somewhere, but it's very difficult to convince somebody who doesn't come from a Catholic perspective. But it does force you, I think, to use the language of natural reason to convey difficult truths.
And I've seen a picture of you with the Catholic chaplaincy at Oxford University there, teaching on different things. That's part of what you do, as well as educating, and how important that is for young Catholics to be able to defend the faith and to show the philosophical underpinnings of our faith. Yes,
I've been working with Catholic chaplaincies around the UK and Ireland over the last 5 years of my time at the Anscombe Bioethics Centre. And one thing I have to say is that I've always had a warm reception from Catholic chaplains around the country. I think there isn't a chaplain who doesn't realize that bioethics is a live set of issues for everyone. Nobody would pretend that these are issues that even students at university age aren't already coming across. Whether it's contraception, which links to the Church's teaching in Humanae Vitae and Casti Connubii, whether it's abortion, and we know that sadly the abortion rates in the UK, for example, are very high, or even if it's something that will affect their careers down the line if they choose to go into healthcare, into the healthcare professions. Issues of conscientious objection, issues of caring for dying persons, or it might be their own relatives who are facing terminal diagnosis, or who are already deteriorating and being put on an end-of-life pathway in a hospital or a care home. These are issues that affect all of us. And so I would say, although many of that comes out of very difficult or tragic circumstances, on the bright side, I'm very encouraged by the fact that chaplains and indeed students have always been very keen to find out more about Catholic bioethics.
Talk a bit about forming a Catholic conscience, or forming our conscience just in general, that sometimes a defense for avoiding topics is, well, I'm just following my conscience. But we have an obligation also to form our consciences in the truth.
Yes. Well, the Catholic Church in general has always seen part of its mission as forming the consciences of the faithful, and indeed of the culture beyond the Catholic community, because we are meant to be salt of the earth and the light of the world, in imitation of Christ. And we know that moral issues are quite often the battleground for that. A lot of people, it's not, I don't want to say that moral issues are what ultimately makes the church tick, or what ultimately makes our faith what it is. I think if you go back to what Pope Benedict said in Deus Caritas Est, his first encyclical, Christianity is not a system of moral propositions or anything like that. Fundamentally, it's an encounter with a person, a definitive encounter with Jesus Christ, who has changed the course of history and who has the power to change our lives. That has to be our starting point, at least when we think about forming consciences, when we think about evangelizing the culture. But we also recognize that for many people, anecdotally, we know many people leave the church precisely because of one moral issue or another. There are others who leave for different reasons, scandals in the church, but anecdotally, most of us will know somebody, a family member, a friend, who feels a particular teaching to be a hard one, a difficult one to live out in, say, their vocation as a doctor or as a married person. And so the formation of consciences has an important role to play, but it has to be situated in the overall framework of what we're trying to do to spread the good news. I think that's why that title of John Paul II's great encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the gospel of life, is so important, because it reminds us that fundamentally Catholic bioethics is good news. Fundamentally, the aim of Catholic bioethics cannot but be the salvation of souls, beatitude. And if that is our perspective, it's not just about moral perfection in a kind of selfish or self-centered way, but it's about salvation and what we need for salvation, and how we need to act in accord with that universal call to holiness. If people can be drawn to that, then I think we're on the right track in terms of encouraging the formation of consciences. Then I think, and obviously there is a role, a place for the intellectual side of things, for the arguments, and even, dare I say, for the apologetics, obviously, to be used sensitively.
And really, it's to lead to our flourishing. That's why we have moral laws. That's why we have the commandments, because it's going to lead to our personal, familial, and societal flourishing. And is that something that you've experienced, I guess, in your own young life as a father and husband, and your own life?
Well, very much so in my own life. I mean, I think, well, I'm a cradle Catholic, and I could not, I suppose, I could not imagine my life outside the church. At the same time, in my own, my experience of being with in different parish groups, and of course, in the course of my career at the centre, meeting all kinds of particularly young people, it's given me a window into an insight into the kind of real pastoral struggles that people face. Obviously, my role as a researcher isn't fundamentally pastoral in the way that a parish priest's would be. Nonetheless, in the area of bioethics, the pastoral and the intellectual often collide. You can't really separate the two. And I think personally for me, looking at my own life, the church's teaching and besides that, the whole Catholic intellectual tradition that has been built up over the last 2,000 years and counting, I mean that often for me has been a source of inspiration. I think it still has the power to change the way all of us think. You mentioned flourishing, and today one of the values that people really cling on to very much, almost at all costs, is the idea of freedom, but it's often a sense of freedom to do whatever you like.
Yes.
A freedom not to be interfered with, not to be judged, indeed not to be condemned, not to be told differently. And I always go back to that wonderful book, The Sources of Christian Ethics, by Father Servet Kinkars, a Belgian Dominican of the 20th century, where he makes that rather nice distinction between the freedom of indifference and the freedom for excellence. Ooh. And he gives some very useful examples, saying, for example, if you've got a piano in front of you, well, you could make, with the first kind of freedom, the freedom of indifference, you could make a whole, you can make any kind of, you can make noise, you can make a whole racket just by pressing any key you would like. And that is freedom. It is a kind of freedom to do. And that is, sadly, the conception of freedom many of us have today in modern secular Western society. But he said, think, by contrast, of the person who would subject themselves to the discipline of practice, of rehearsal, learning the language of music, perhaps of training their body. That's a very Pauline metaphor there, of training your body, subjecting it in order to produce, to be able to play the most beautiful sonata or concerto. And now if you look at two, well, one the novice pianist and the other the master at the instrument, who would we say is actually more free? I think we have the capacity to recognize that it's the second person, the one who is free for excellence, who has a different kind of, a more interior, a deeper source of freedom. It's a freedom to be the best person they can be relative to that instrument, and not so much the mere freedom to act in a very, very limited range of capacities. And so once we think about flourishing, excellence, we have a different model for thinking about freedom and autonomy.
That is a wonderful distinction. Thank you for sharing that with us. Now, you talk with young people and others. What are some of the common questions or issues that people bring to you, trying to get some clarity on them?
Well, we, as part of our service to the church, we often get queries from the general public, indeed from many of whom would be from the Catholic community, and particularly from healthcare professionals, young doctors or nurses, finding their way in their careers, in their professions. And I would say that the two most common types of questions that I have received personally have been, one, to do with end-of-life care, and secondly, to do with conscience, the role of, the ability to practice their healthcare profession in accordance with their conscience, with the demands of Catholic teaching. And these are the two, I think it shows, these are very particular to perhaps the state of healthcare in Britain and in Ireland. It may be different in other countries, I don't know. But here, end-of-life care is something that affects everyone. It might be because they're the relative of a patient in hospital, in a care home. It might be because they themselves are curious about this aspect of the church's teaching, whereas so many other social issues have have gone a certain way of liberalization in the United Kingdom, uh, and, and there's almost no room for public debate. It's very hard, for example, to even start a debate about a question like abortion in the United Kingdom. Certainly, IVF has been thoroughly accepted by the medical profession, by people in the general public. But euthanasia and assisted suicide continues to be something that divides people. And I think, well, whereas many European countries and some states in the US have already gone in the direction of legalizing either or both of the two practices, euthanasia or assisted suicide, the UK, despite repeated attempts, despite having had the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, which has now changed its name to Dignity in Dying, around for over 80 years, I think, the United Kingdom has still held firm on this bright red line that doctors should not kill their patients or provide them with the means of ending their own lives. I think that's an interesting fact in itself.
Well, let's talk about one of the issues that was recently in the news in England of Alfie Evans and that whole situation. It's a teaching opportunity in a way, isn't it?
Yes. I think we found, again, in our role as a Catholic academic institute, that so often people turn to us not for any campaigning or lobbying. That's not what we do. We're not a lobby organization. But people look to us for a well-informed and scholarly, but also accessible source of information about difficult cases such as Alfie Evans. So, and I'm sure this is familiar to many viewers. In both the UK and in the US, Alfie Evans was a toddler who was the subject of multiple court rulings in England, and the courts basically ordered that his ventilation be removed, that he be allowed to die, and this was because he was diagnosed with an incurable brain condition. His parents wanted to bring him by air ambulance to Italy, where some doctors were willing to continue treating him indefinitely. It seemed with a ventilator to keep him alive. It wouldn't have cured him, but it would have at least kept him alive for some time, and we don't know how long that would have been. And Alfie Evans has been one of several cases of a similar nature along those lines. Charlie Gard was another one before him, but Alfie Evans so far I think has been the one that's captured really the well, I don't want to say captured the imagination, but certainly has captured a broad the concerns of a broad range of people in the British public and also in America.
You know what I like? I visited your website, and you have like press releases which give you kind of a short Catholic response, moral response, but then you have longer papers on these types of issues. So why don't you talk about how people can learn more? How can they contact the Anscombe Centre, and what resources you have available?
Yeah, so the Anscombe Centre, like many other institutes of our kind, we regularly put up briefing papers, press statements, and other documents to help inform the public. They're all on our website, www.bioethics.org.uk. It's a very easy domain name to remember. And you can search our archive of press statements, for example, which will include some of our comments, both of shorter and longer ones on the Charlie Gard and the Alfie Evans cases. And I think one of the, as I recall, our first ever press statement which was on the Charlie Gard case, and again a very similar case, was entitled "Charlie Gard Doing the Right Thing for the Right Reasons."
Yes.
And I thought that wasn't my title, but I thought that title very succinctly put across something, a very key touchstone of Catholic moral thinking, that we're not just concerned with the results. It's not just about whether, objectively speaking, removing a ventilator, withdrawing treatment is permissible, or in fact even the best thing to do. That's an important question. It's also about why we act in such a way. What are our motivations? What are the values that we are embodying in our decisions to treat or not to treat.
Well, thank you. You
So,
have many wonderful resources there. I highly recommend our people to go there for different moral questions they may have. So thank you for being with us today, Michael Wee.
thank you very much.